We are live.
Veena, ready?
Yeah.
Greetings and welcome to this SAPAN event, The Next Wave. My name is Udita Devapriya. I'm a researcher and writer based in Colombo, and I'm proud to be a long-time South Asia Peace Action Network, or SAPAN, member. I'm honored to host today's event. We're all excited that SAPAN is reviving its last Sunday of month discussions after a long break. The break, however, does not mean that our work has stopped. Far from it. In May and June, I worked with journalist and SAPAN co-founder Beena Sarwa on her documentary, Democracy in Debt, Sri Lanka Beyond the Headlines, a 25-minute film supported by the Pulitzer Center in the US. In July and August, the film was screened at various venues in Sri Lanka and Pakistan. And in September, it played at around 50 venues in 14 countries across 5 continents around the time of Sri Lanka's presidential elections. These elections are, of course, linked to our topic today. In 2022, Sri Lanka faced an upsurge in citizen mobilization against a deeply unpopular government. The presidential elections last month can be seen as the beginning of the next chapter in that movement. Similar uprisings have spread in South Asia, including in Bangladesh, Pakistan, even India. It is against the backdrop of these uprisings and movements that we are here to discuss the next wave. How social movements rise and fall, how they are shaped, and what their future may be. As we start, I request everyone to please mute your mics. Please also introduce yourselves in the chat. Please use the chat for questions or comments. We request everyone to stay on topic and be courteous and respectful. To please be patient also with technical difficulties. And as always, we invite suggestions and feedback from everyone. Before I hand over controls, SAPAN volunteer Vidya Kakra will share SAPAN's 3-point founding charter, which has been endorsed by nearly 100 organizations and nearly 600 individuals in the region and the diaspora. Over to you, Vidya.
Thank you, Udita. Can you please give me a moment as I share the founding charter? Is my screen visible to everyone?
Yeah.
Greetings, everyone. I am Vidya, and I am a human rights lawyer from Mumbai, India, and I am a volunteer at SAPAN. I'm honored to share the SAPAN founding charter with you. Briefly, it calls upon the governments and peoples of South Asian nations to institute soft borders, to allow freedom of trade and travel to each other's countries, to ensure human rights and dignity for all citizens, including religious and ethnic minorities, and cooperate in all areas, particularly related to public health, culture, and legal reform, education, environment, climate change, etc. It is also online in several languages. Do take a look at the website www.southasiapeace.com and endorse the charter if you haven't already. Thank you, and I'm going to hand it over to another SAPAN volunteer, journalist Pragyan Srivastava, to share the in memoriam section of the presentation.
Thank you, Vidya. And hello, everyone. As Vidya mentioned, I'm a journalist from India. This is my first event with SAPAN. I'm honored to be tasked with upholding the SAPAN tradition of commemorating those whose vision for a peaceful region we take forward. Luminaries like Dr. Mubashir Hassan, I.A. Rahman, Asma Jahangir, and others who you see on the screen who left us before Sapan was born. We honor comrades who passed away later like Rubina Saigal, Kamla Bhasin, Admiral Ramu Ramdas, Karamat Ali, and others. Let us also pay our tributes to some prominent individuals who shared our values and have passed on since our last meeting. Sigma Huda, G.N. Sai Baba, David Page, Shujaya Sham, Simin Akhtar, Richard A. Cash. A memorial for Dr. Cash is taking place at this moment in Brookline, Massachusetts. Thank you. We will observe a moment of silence. Thank you. Back to you, Udita.
Thank you, Pragyan. That was very moving. We now come to our panel discussion, moderated by my friend Faisal Lalani. Faisal M. Lalani is a global community organizer with a background in research, activism, writing, technology, and policy. He has worked all over the world, studying progressive pedagogies in rural Nepal, building community wireless networks in townships around South Africa, and analyzing social media patterns of politicians during major elections in India with Microsoft Research. Faisal also partnered with several US state governments to manage the COVID-19 pandemic and contact tracing through Dimagi and consulted with high-profile companies throughout the country on data governance and AI for Snowflake. Faisal recently spent several months in Sri Lanka and the APAC region at large, organizing civil society, journalists, lawyers, and big tech to support regional internet governance efforts and online safety legislation. He is a graduate from the University of Oxford's Media Policy Seminar Institute and holds a degree in computer science from the University of Colorado in Boulder. He is also a close, dear friend of mine and a close, dear friend of so many Sri Lankans and South Asians. Faisal, over to you.
I don't see Faisal because he had a power cut. As we know, just as the meeting started, he's in Seattle, and there was a power cut in Seattle. So Faisal is not, he joined from his phone earlier, but I don't see him now. So Udita, do you mind introducing the panelists, the other speakers? And then maybe if Faisal joins, then we can do, and we all know the questions, so we can make do. You're muted.
So basically, I have the pleasure and honor of introducing the speakers for the event. First, Amma Ali Jan. Amma Ali Jan is an activist, historian, and educator. He holds a PhD in history from Cambridge, where he worked on communist thought in India. His work explores the intersection of communism and nationalism in colonial India by examining how European ideas are extended and reshaped as they circulate in the non-European world. He is also a member of the Haqooq-e-Khalq Party, Pakistan, and the Progressive International. He has taught at Government College, Punjab University, and Forman Christian College in Lahore, Pakistan. He is a regular contributor to the News International and is also the author of the book Ruled by Fear, 8 Theses on Authoritarianism in Pakistan, published in 2021. I also have the pleasure of introducing Doan Rai, a computer scientist and writer, also the director of strategy at Body and Data, a nonprofit organization that works on digital rights and feminist internet. She has a PhD in computer science from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, USA, with research in the intersection of educational psychology, game design, and AI. She has worked as a software engineer, content creator, researcher, and educator trained teacher in Nepal and the US. She has developed technology platforms for youth education and initiated educational programs in data science and machine learning. She is a member of the development board of the University of Nepal and has been an active participant and organizer in Nepal's civil society movements. She writes opinion articles on socio-political issues in Nepal. I also have the pleasure of introducing Khushi Kabir. She began her involvement with citizens' rights immediately after the liberation of Bangladesh in 1972, while living and working in remote rural areas. In 1980, she joined Nigera Kori, a national-level NGO known for its conscientization approach, creating strong autonomous organizations of the rural poor to assert their rights and ensure their entitlements as citizens. Khushi Kabir is passionately involved in promoting women's equality, rights of marginalized communities, environmental justice, food sovereignty, democratic practices and accountability, inclusivity, and so on and so forth, through a feminist lens. She is active in several national, regional, and international bodies and networks, promoting a common vision towards ensuring equitable land rights, environmental justice, curbing the growth of religious extremism, challenging extrajudicial killings, and so on. Melanie Gunatilaka from Sri Lanka is a feminist, human rights defender, climate and political activist from Sri Lanka and a co-founder of Climate Action Now Sri Lanka. Melanie started her career working in the corporate sector. She subsequently moved to Good Market Sri Lanka, where she worked with several social enterprises and communities that prioritize the well-being of the people and the planet. She founded Climate Action Now Sri Lanka and co-organized protests and demonstrations against ecocide, plastic pollution, and awareness campaigns regarding the urgency of taking just and equitable climate action in the country and the region. Melanie Gunatilaka was a prominent activist during the Aragale protests in Sri Lanka in 2022. The protests were largely fueled by public discontent over the country's economic crisis, which included severe shortages of goods and rising inflation. Gunatilaka played a key role in mobilizing youth and advocating for government accountability and systemic change. She used social media and public forums to raise awareness, organize demonstrations, and express the grievances of the affected population. Her involvement highlighted the broader movement's call for transparency, justice, and a new political direction for Sri Lanka. The protests ultimately led to significant political changes in the country, including the resignation of the then president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Melanie is deeply engaged in political activism, advocating for debt justice, climate justice, and the protection of fundamental freedoms, and an advocate for decolonization. The strong commitment to addressing the intertwined crises of climate change and social inequality, Melanie works to empower marginalized communities. Her efforts focus on fostering inclusive dialogue and driving policy changes that support environmental sustainability and social equality and equity in Sri Lanka and beyond. She currently works with the Debt for the Climate Global Movement, Yukti Collective Sri Lanka, a researcher with the Law and Society Trust, and the Institute for Political Economy Sri Lanka. Finally, I have the pleasure and honor of introducing Swati Narayan, an academic activist and author. Her debut nonfiction book is Unequal: Why India Lags Behind Its Neighbors, published by Westland in 2023. Swati teaches postgraduate courses on social policies in India. For more than a decade, she has also worked with a range of civil society organizations. An alumni of the Tata Institute for Social Sciences, School of Oriental and African Studies, and the London School of Economics and Political Science, her research and opinion articles have been published in several journals and media publications. Ladies and gentlemen, These are our speakers for the evening. I now pass it over to them. Thank you.
Udita, just to let you know, Faisal is back.
Yeah.
He is able to, there's no power across Seattle, so he's been running around to various coffee shops, and he's joined on his phone. So let me see if I can find him. There he goes. Faisal, you can unmute and take it over. You need to unmute, Faisal. We cannot hear you, Faisal. Okay, I see you unmuting now.
Hi, can you all hear me?
But yes. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. I cannot believe my luck. Literally 5 minutes before the panel, there's like a citywide outage. But anyway, thank you so much, Udita. Hi, everyone. My name is Faisal Alani. I am an Indian and a Muslim, born in Hyderabad and raised in the United States. Like Udita might have said, for years I've put on many different hats, working all over the world in the fields of everything from digital rights and media policy to education reform and public health. When you get older, you'll see how the world really works, is something I've heard from every corner of the world at this point. I used to be really find myself getting angry more and more in response, because for every person who tells me why my optimism is displaced, I see 10 brilliant, passionate, youthful spirits demonstrating otherwise. Of that, there are 100 farmers refusing to budge. There are 10 students refusing to accept an oppressive status quo, relegated to the past and assigned to the actions of a single individual, when in fact collective change is happening now. Social movements are not an end, but a means towards the values of freedom, peace, equality, and compassion. And so, to start the conversation, Melanie, I'd like to turn to you. Something I think is foundational to any conversation about movements is how they even begin. What are the signs that a citizenry can unite behind a cause? What enablers ensure that collective advocacy is on the horizon? How do movements start? So, Melanie, would you like to take it away?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the organizers, Sapan, and for having me. And I'll just jump into the question so we can have enough time for everybody as well. I believe that movement, especially in countries like ours, especially in the global south, starts as forms of resistance. In Sri Lanka, we saw before in April 2022, the Occupy movement, which turned into a massive movement that resulted in political changes happen. Starting from 2018, 2019, 2021, all of these years, there were so many different ways that people were rejecting and resisting the status quo. I'd like to highlight a few significant movements. One was the farmers' struggle in this area called Valsapugala, where farmers continued a protest movement, an Occupy movement, which went on to for longer than 100 days. It was also a fast unto death protest, and they were demanding an end to the human-wildlife conflict, and they were asking for land dedicated for animals, right? And there were also the protest by the student movement, and the teachers were protesting the high stationery cost and the salary discrepancies. And we have seen protests by so many working class people in Sri Lanka, which and also the environmental movements, who were protesting against various issues pertaining to the environment and also human rights. So with all of these events, I think they one thing is that they also give strength and assurance for others that it is possible for people to speak up, especially when the governments are repressive and tyrannical, and the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression continuously get shut down. More and more people who speaks up, especially the organized groups like trade unions, farmers, fishers, student activists, these give strength to the general public. So we saw this happening like a wave, one after the other, one after the other. This kept happening. And that's what led to the event in 2022, whereas we had this massive crisis of shortages of fuel and basic necessities like electricity and gas, which drove people more and more towards joining the protest movement. And also it helped people organize. When smaller pocket protests started happening in Colombo, there were subsequent protests started all around the island. And as people went into these locations, they got to know each other, they made connections, and they started organizing between themselves. So this ended up leading up to July 2022. So I'll stop there and add on if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's so interesting. I mean, I was lucky enough to spend quite a bit of time in Sri Lanka earlier this year and late last. And this public consciousness that you're talking about, this idea of stirring different groups of people to fight for a common cause was so prevalent. Another country that I see this a lot in or have heard a lot about is Bangladesh. And Kushi, maybe you can speak a little bit to this. How do movements usually begin in Bangladesh? What are the patterns you see there?
I think very much the same and similar to all the countries, but definitely in our region, but other countries too. I think movements begin when there is any kind of a repression, there's any kind of feeling of that you are not being able to speak out, you're not being able to exercise your rights, you're not having a voice. And so that kind of feeling of being repressed and stopped leads people to start protesting and coming together. And when one starts coming and feeling that the back is really against the wall and they can't move any further, they feel that the only way out is the movement. And when they come out and they see there are others like them, that's when a movement begins. And I'll just say that in Bangladesh, the history of Bangladesh, every major event was through a movement rather than any other kind of a political change. If we talk about the language movement which started immediately after Pakistan was created, which culminated in the 52 language movement, the movement against the autocratic Ayub Khan dictatorship, the movement for Bangladesh, that was the most biggest and the most impactful people's movement where everybody from all over and all walks of life, every village, workers, students, people in the government, people who were in the army, average citizens everywhere from all over just took part, which culminated in our War of Liberation. And since then, there have been movements. There have been the anti-Irshad autocratic movement. And the last is this huge wave that we've just witnessed this August 5th, which is also called July 36th, because it started in July and they looked at it as the July Revolution. So it was overturning a government which was totally there for 15 and a half years and felt that they were invincible. They felt that because they were invincible, there was no need to listen to voices of the people. So the people, when they feel that is happening, and when they start protesting and coming out as a movement, and from the other side, from the government side, there is shooting, there's killing, there's mass arrests, there's all kinds of, curbing of every right that any citizen ever has. People do not, just go back. I think all our history has shown over and over again, the more repression you use, the stronger and bigger the movement is. And that's what happened in Bangladesh. It became so big that Awami League, Sheikh Hasina, had to flee the country, and we got we got rid of Awami League and its dictatorial regime. I'll stop there and we'll go back later on.
Thank you, Kushi. I also invite other speakers to kind of jump in at certain points. We can definitely keep this like an informal conversation. But something that I want to follow up on is Melanie, she both you, your answers kind of have this theme about how social movements and revolutions, they don't always, I mean, they don't really begin when people are just out on the street. They begin in the hearts and minds of the people before any physical action is actually taken.
Absolutely.
However, I've noticed that over time, and maybe it's because politically our dynamics have also shifted from maybe pursuits of a politics, I want to say more of consensus, as opposed to now where I feel like it's more of a politics of confrontation. So maybe I can turn to Dovan here. How do you think that organized activists, mobilized groups that feel politically discouraged from participating or historically disempowered?
Faisal, can you please repeat? Like, I cannot hear you clearly. Can you repeat your question again?
I'm so sorry. I was saying that how do you see activists can successfully encourage and activate groups that have historically felt discouraged by politics or culturally speaking?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Faisal. And this is my first time, engaging with the Sapan community, and I'm really thankful to the organizers and again Faisal for connecting me to that. And if I heard Faisal's question correctly, so I'm sorry. Like, can you repeat the question again? Like, I don't know why it is like your signal is not that clear on my part.
No, it's the city here wants us to ask you questions. I was asking, how do you find consensus among different groups of people in order to
Okay.
collectively organize?
All right. Okay, yeah. So in Nepal's social movements, like the three social movements that I was directly involved, the anti-monarchy movement, the Madhis movement, and the civil society movement that is happening right now. And my observation has been that for Nepal, and I think like similar to the South Asian countries, a lot of our social movements have been a culmination of both political and this, cultural movements where the dissatisfaction, like the economic issues, the press freedom, and this autocratic government, the issue of democracy, which is very combined with a lot of like interconnected other issues like the indigenous communities, the Madhesi communities, the Dalit communities, and the women and all that. And so it has been always like all these different kind of this issues, that has like culminated in this like a national movement. And for me personally, I have seen that lately when I come into this civil society movement, um, sometimes it is difficult, like when the threat is not very prominent, like for example, in the anti-monarchy movement, the threat was very prominent, right? It is this like very autocratic monarchy that we had to overthrow. And when it came to the Madhis movement, it was also kind of like there was very this legitimate, this very vocal issue. But now at this point, what I see is that okay, so what I see is that sometimes it is very difficult when the issue is very amorphous. When we are talking about this very overarching issue of democracy and identity politics, it can be difficult to have this very overarching framework. And for I think that if I'm talking about this current movement, I think like we need this very overarching framework to combine all these different voices together.
Thank you, Dovan. I see so many parallels here between every answer, specifically across geography, which was a big theme of Well, I had the pleasure of participating in a book talk with you. Recent book, which I highly recommend to everybody. It's called Unequal. You talk about how there's been a lot of social movements in India that have attempted to thwart gender, class, and especially caste discrimination. But why do many of them fail in certain parts of India, like the North, compared to successful movements in the South?
Thanks, Faisal. And also thanks to Bina for organizing this. It's wonderful to be part of SAPAN. And I'm also delighted to see that some of the people I've been inspired by, someone I know as Lolly Auntie is here, Kavita is here. So all of the stalwarts of the social movements in India are here. I don't hope to speak for them, but what I'll say is that India is a country, and perhaps a lot of the shared history within South Asia is based on the anti-colonial movement that we've all shared together, which was a civil disobedience movement. So to say that North and South India have a big difference, perhaps exists in some sense, but not in its entirety. So the farmers' movement, for example, was very strong in northern India. Though there was a lot of support from the south, the northern farmers, especially in Punjab and Haryana, were able to sustain it for a longer period of time. But my research shows, historical research, that when it comes to other movements like anti-caste movements or the women's movements, the southern India, which has had a longer history of literacy, a longer history of a different form of British land settlement, these movements have been more strongly rooted and been able to annihilate caste and work towards its annihilation, as opposed to the North, where the focus has been more tame in terms of emulating caste. So I think there are certain peculiar characteristics of Southern India, including higher levels of literacy, the fact that there were missionary activities there, which had external influences, princely states, and also the cultural ties, for example, between Sri Lanka and Kerala and Tamil Nadu, which helped the flow of ideas, including communist ideals, across borders. So it's a long, complicated history. The North is good in some areas, the South in the others, but I think learning across borders is an interesting facet of South India.
Thank you, Swati. You know, thus far, I feel like we have been able to distinguish a lot of these factors that lead to these movements becoming movements, i.e. people kind of being motivated and united by a common cause, an ability to curb inequalities, as Swati just said. And a lot of what I also am interested in is what turns something temporary, perhaps a single protest or a petition or whatever have you, into something more permanent. And maybe Amar, you take this one, all temporary to something more permanent, a revolution.
Thank you, Faisal, and thank you, Sapan and Bina, for organizing this. You know, I was really enjoying the conversation, and I think it's very important for us to share these notes, and these borders have not only segregated the space of South Asia, but also the minds in some ways, that we're not sharing as much information as we should among activists. And, you know, South Asia has become, after what happened in Bangladesh, after what's happened in Sri Lanka, and what's happening in Pakistan, India, it's become a very central place for rethinking politics in the contemporary moment. So I think it's these kinds of forums give this unique kind of opportunity to have these discussions. Faisal, to your question, I think it's there are two ways to look at this question of endurance or the prolongment of a movement. One of the things that we see over the last 10, 15 years is that you've had these movements that start with a particular issue, but then they spread and become a more kind of systemic critiques of the government. So the most famous is the Arab Spring, of course, which is one example of something that starts off on a question of dignity in Tunisia, then becomes this much larger question about the state structures in the Arab world, about the questions of the political economy, of dignity, of sovereignty of these countries. So what you have is this latent kind of anger, this latent rage that exists in the unconscious that has not been tapped into. And all of a sudden you have these explosions, and political scientists are unable to explain why this is happening. They think there's a conspiracy or there's a foreign element. All of this kind of paranoia exists because people are the ruling classes and their mouthpieces are unable to understand, to identify the latent rage that builds up in society. The same is true for Bangladesh. The same is true for Sri Lanka, I assume. That there's these are societies that were on the verge of something big, but those in power, because they see things from the point of view of law and order, they only look at the expressions of anger and rage as some kinds of criminal or foreign elements. So they are unable to understand them. Their only language is one of repression and criminalization of dissidents. And thus you have this kind of dialectic between this accumulating rage that bursts and this criminalization of the state. And Ms. Khushi Kabir was absolutely right. The more you repress, the more it increases, because it's that rage which is coming out. And the more you repress it, the rage accumulates even more. It multiplies. So it's a terrible tactic for the ruling classes to deploy in moments of crisis. But one other thing I would perhaps suggest for discussion is that we have seen these last 10 years as years of massive uprisings of you can call them revolutions as well. However, the system has proven itself far more durable than these revolutionary movements. For example, in the Arab Spring, but also one can say in the case of many other movements, Occupy Wall Street and others. We are in a situation where people are protesting, people are resisting, but the movements over time get co-opted. They become part of the system. I'm not suggesting every individual, but there's something about the way the system is so entrenched that it kind of it recycles itself even after a cycle of protest and mass movement. So I think one of the things that we'll have to discuss is to kind of go back to the early 20th century debates on how to repeat this cycle of protest, victory, defeat, protest, victory, defeat, and think of what kinds of pragmatic plans can come forward that actually break this cycle. So in some ways, we are in need of more grand ideas that can reorient our movements, so that we are not just protest movements or against this or against that, but we become affirmative movements, affirming a particular vision for society, a particular vision for future. And this move from negation to affirmation, I think, is now the responsibility of activists and thinkers to take this initiative forward. So I think that is the feeling that I get amongst activists across the world that we talk to, that there is this feeling that we protested but it didn't go through. I think the protests, they're never wasted. They allow us an opening into a different kind of a world, but then they need new kinds of ideas, new kinds of organizational structures, new kinds of programs in order to push the promise of these movements forward. And that's, I think, where we're at today.
Amar, I think you point out extremely significant points here, specifically around this idea of co-opting, and I think even an elite capture of social justice in a lot of ways. And you pointed out replicating what happened in the 20s. And I think that's a great example, especially given how big labor movements were around then. So it leads me to ask,
Vessel, we can't hear you. We kind of lost you for a minute. You said something about asking something.
Sorry. I was going to ask, how do you ensure that we go beyond the symbolic, that everything that we are doing culturally, a protest, goes into something tangible, either politically or institutionally? And maybe Melanie, you'd like to start with that?
Do you mind please repeating the last part of the question, please?
Sure. I was asking how do you, the protest, the symbolic, the cultural advocacy into something more tangible, either politically or institutionally?
Right. Okay, understood. Thank you so much. So I think there are a few aspects to that. One is initially when people come together, they usually come with a demand that is more personal or more closer to their communities and something that is much more closer to home. Right? They would have an immediate demand that they would want to fulfill. But as movements grow larger, as we collaborate with other groups or other social movements that are already existing, it opens our eyes to different perspectives and the different that helps us to understand different aspects of this system that we're all fighting against. The way I see it is all those different groups, even all of us in the different countries in the same region or in all around the world, we are all fighting this one system, one enemy, but we're fighting this at different angles and different places. So in order for us to turn this into a more tangible and more sustainable fight, or I think it is important for us to understand all of these other struggles and how it is connected, because we have this tendency to prioritize, right? And the existing system or whoever's running the existing system keeps telling us, you always have to prioritize this, and there are issues that never gets prioritized, right? And especially when it comes to the marginalized groups issues, such as and all those. So in order for us to turn this into a much more tangible and to institutionalize, I think that's where it becomes tricky, because you have to engage in the system, right? That's where we need to take this very common saying of you need to go into the system to fight it a bit seriously, and to understand that when we go into the system, or when we have our representatives go into the system, that they don't change themselves, right? That our movements don't end up mirroring the system itself. Right? So I think that is the hardest part that I am personally struggling to understand, and I think it also requires collective efforts in terms of we also talk about that we need the systems to be transparent and accountable. But then, as resistance movement, as citizens movement, we also struggle in terms of strategizing. If we are going to strategize, and if we are also transparent about our strategizing, we are giving all of our plans to whoever that we are fighting also, right? So I think creating new structures and also understanding how we can use technology, because especially in Sri Lanka, we saw there's a lot of people used Telegram groups, WhatsApp groups, to social media. And I think this wave of using social media in movements is quite new. And we are all still trying to understand the benefits and the costs of this too. Right? So I think when we start from there, it's also really, really necessary that we have the guidance and the experience from the activists who have been fighting the system for a lot longer than we have. Because especially since I think 2022, we see lots of youth activists coming out, and we are given spaces, and we have been taking up spaces, and our voices are given with more prominence than it did before. So, but if we are not going to understand the historical impact of the current context, especially considering things like debt, colonialism, and all of those struggles, and the minority struggles as well, without that historical context, we are not really going to create something sustainable. That's when I think it can very easily get either hijacked or can be shut down very easily. So this knowledge sharing between these different generations is really, really important. And it's not only between the generations, but also between different social groups and different social movements as well. As an example, minority groups and the sexual minorities as an example, right? So understanding how that we are all oppressed with this system, but at what lens and where our strengths and weaknesses are. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I think you bring up an excellent follow-up, and I'm going to ask this to the speakers at large, and I'm also going to ask the audience that if you have questions, please start coming up with them now, because I'll open it up the floor after this. But to all of you, what is the most important lesson that you've learned when it comes to the movements that you've studied or been a part of? And again, this is for the whole group, so anyone feel free to speak up.
Could I speak up?
Of course.
All right. Yeah. So, yeah, can you hear me? I'm unmuted, I think, yeah. So I think the discussions that were going along were very important and very crucial. And I'll come to the question that you raised and you asked immediately. But before that, I'd just like to state that when a system is so entrenched and it's so firmly, integrated into a very large and strong and immovable system, when a movement happens because a lot of people have come together from very different spheres and streams because they have a common issue and a common oppressor that they want to get rid of. But after that, after that has happened, what do you do? I think, Melanie, you did raise the question of, do you get into becoming a part of it and then trying to then see, can you change the system from within? But then do you get sucked into the system? Does it become like a tokenism, or is the system much bigger than what you think and you cannot do? And then to bring in, and this is something that I'd like to say is what I'm coming into the last part, is what I've learned from movements is after the movement and there's a euphoria, there's a big energized thing. And then after that, you really don't have a way and a forward of what you're going to be doing. So there are some people who seem to be the ones who are thinking what needs to be done for the country. And but the majority, like you're talking about different minoritized groups, marginalized groups. They may be indigenous communities, they may be religious minorities, they may be sexual or gender diverse people, which again, some who are in the mainstream of the leadership now from the movement do not want to accept. So if a group has a particular vision and position, this is what they want the new revolution or the new whatever to be like, and it may not resonate with every other sections who were part of the entire movement, there's bound to be some kind of a disillusionment. And I think that's very worrying. And this is something that I feel we all have to be very careful and start talking about, is how do we not lose the momentum? How do we not lose a lot of people who feel excluded? And how do we change the system without it totally collapsing into anarchy? And we've found that every time, as I said right at the beginning when I started, that Bangladesh has had a lot of movements. All historical movements was a result of historical incidents, or were as a result of movements. But why did it not continue? Why is it that it just continues to follow the same line? And I think that is because we ourselves are not collectively together. And I think this is something for the region. I think this discussion is extremely important, and I'd like this to continue later on at a stage of how can we learn from each other, and how can we as South Asians start thinking of something that is much newer, that is much more organic, and that is much more inclusive in every way, that does not exclude others, that does not marginalize others, and that does not make anyone feel insecure. I think that the euphoria of the moment when you win is something, but afterwards, the kind of letdown that often people feel is something that one has to be very clear about. And I see this as something that all of us who are in movements, we get involved in the moment. It's that moment that we're involved into. But we have to start thinking much more positively about where we want this movement to go and to continue and what needs to be done. So I'll stop there.
I want to hear everybody's key lesson, but I also want to add, because she just inspired this, personally speaking, how do you all build resilience when it comes to being an activist, being an advocate? I feel like oftentimes I feel defeated, and I'm sure you all get this question all the time. So in addition to this important lesson, I would love to hear about how each of you stay personally resilient and willing to always fight. Amar, maybe would you like to?
No, I think
Dhovan
Dhovan
go ahead.
Dhovan wanted to say something.
Dhovan has a hand.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Okay.
can
Yeah.
see, sorry.
Yeah. So for me, I feel like the problems, I mean, as you all know, right, that our problems have even become more complex, and it has even become more multidimensional. Now, all the technological challenges, environmental challenges, and the economic and all this identity challenge, all these are all culminate together. So talking about the resilience, as a woman from the indigenous community, what I feel like we really need to, I'm not saying as like, okay, blaming the victim, right? But just trying to put the onus in our marginalized community. My observation has been that we need to get out sometimes of the sectoral issues, right? Sometimes we have this tendency just talk about own sectoral issues without connecting it to the broader issues. And sometimes the people on the who have the more power and privilege, they might also kind of put us into this like little box, right? And sometimes we fear that, oh, we might be co-opted, and then that fear again, or it can again confine us into that box. So how do we come out of that, right? How do we connect all these different issues together to create this overarching this vision and this framework? And also maybe because I'm a computer scientist, right? So because I don't come from the very I bring my computer science perspective. So sometimes I feel like in the activism, we can be confined again as this very oppositional, this very, as Amber also mentioned, right, as a very adversarial approach, focus on the resistance, because we see space more only from the power lens, right? But how do we see that space, right, which has the power and resources more from the exploratory perspective, right? How do we see that space, not just some kind of like zero-sum game, but something that we can, create more space, as a more creative, generative space. So, and my final point is, I have again, this is my personal observation, that sometimes I feel like we have come to this kind of wall with the political rhetoric, sometimes like we have been talking about these things, we are not finding the solution. So we really need like very new ways of thinking. And again, the psychology and spirituality have their own baggage, but I really feel that now we really need to combine both the psychological and spiritual conversation in our political and cultural struggle.
I so
Thanks,
agree with you,
Dhovan.
Dhovan. Sorry, Faisal, can I?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. And I've just been reading this fantastic book by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is called The Message. And he speaks exactly about this, where the entire Western liberalism and white supremacy really has come to a point where you really wonder what are the ideals on which we are placing our hope on. And I think this is an important time for the entire Southern movements to start rethinking how not only do we want to strategize, but what is our larger vision and dream, something that Amar spoke about. So if you ask me, for me, my greatest inspirations, amongst many other movements, has been the suffragette movement, which for 60 years fought for women's right to vote. And I think the slogan of that, deeds, not words, and also the fact that courage calls to courage everywhere, has been hugely inspiring for me. And after reading Ta-Nehisi's message, I feel like, we should also be in so much solidarity with Palestine right now, which is bearing the brunt of so-called Western liberalism. And I hope our conversation takes us forward.
I would like to add something to that, and I definitely agree with both Amar, Swati, and Dawn and Khushi, everybody, that like we have two fights. Like we have this one fight that we're fighting against the existing imperialism, and then we also need to be thinking about building new systems and understanding what values and what we want them to be rooted in. But I just wanted to highlight one thing, especially with what's happening in Gaza and Palestine. It has made very clear that the existing systems that were kept in place to ensure peace, or I don't know what they call it anymore, but existing systems that they had in place is no longer working. Or we have understood the limitations of the UN system, as an example, right? So if the UN system doesn't work, what works? Can we build something that could work? Or should we completely give up hope in that? Or should we still use the UN system to, for whatever that they can do, we are understanding their limitations, but also find, better ways to achieve what they can't help us to achieve. Because at the end of the day, I think Global South has the most number of people in the world. And Global South is also the victims of climate crisis, debt crisis, poverty, like food security, so many different issues that most of them stems from this historical colonial. So I think when we strategize and when we also think of like building new, we need to sort of understand where we are at with these existing mechanisms as well. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Faisal, maybe if I can jump in here. I'm so glad we're having such a fantastic conversation, and I joined Swati and Melanie in expressing solidarity with the people of Gaza, the people of Palestine, the people of Lebanon, the people of Iran. The whole region is facing the aggression of the Zionist entity. And I think that what's happening in Gaza is not unique. And I agree with Melanie here. This is we have an entire history of Western imperialism. North Korea, and the Korean War, about 3 to 4 million people were butchered in that war. Like imagine 3 to 4 million, 65% of the infrastructure destroyed. Vietnam, you had about 3 million people killed. Bengal famine, about 3 million people in the 40s. Then not to mention the Holocaust, not only in Europe, but also in the Americas of the indigenous people. So there's this entire history, and now I think people are becoming more and more aware that we're living in the end times. This is a system that no longer believes in any kind of reconstruction. This is destruction without reconstruction. So there will be no Marshall Plan or any kind of reconstruction. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Gaza, this is the future that the civilized world is offering to the global south. So we have to be very serious about charting an alternative. And this is where I think I'd like to come back to what Ma'am Khushi and Dovan said earlier. One, in terms of seeing our own identities, which of course are very much like wounded identities, depending on where the wound comes from. Could be as a marginalized person of color, or could be about gender, or could be about sexuality, ethnicity, language, whatever it is. That wounded identity is part of a larger system, which is a killing machine that gives us these wounds. And we have to try to situate wounds within this larger system, so that we then see other wounded people with different kinds of wounds, but wounded nonetheless, so that we can start connecting our pain across these divisions. Because there's a system that can, if we look at it only in parts, then it will simply allow you to be, as Faisal said earlier, to be co-opted. A certain section of a particular identity that will be given, some kind of representation, where while the system, which, as we say, it's a demolition squad, a killing machine, will continue doing its destruction. In the elections in the US, you can see that clearly. I mean, you have all these identity politics that are being played out with the presidential candidates, and yet there's absolute consensus on genocide, on committing genocide. So it's there's a bankruptcy of this liberal vision that's becoming more and more obvious. And just to take further the point that Ma'am Khushi raised, I think that it is absolutely true that social movements bring all kinds of disparate elements together. And you have this moment of convergence, this euphoria that happens. It is almost impossible to maintain that euphoria for too long. In any case, it's not even something that activists should wish for, that you will be able to maintain that level of kind of upsurge for a very long time. What becomes important the day after is, how do you create a certain orientation for activists, for thinkers, for the future of the world, for the future of your society? And at this particular point in history, we have these 2-3 tasks ahead of us. One, we can no longer afford to be just a protest movement. I think there is this, I'm so glad there's this consensus that's emerging. It's because, we are entering a phase where our regions will become the center of the new Cold War. We have to think of what our state policies have to be. We'll have to think about big questions like economic policies, big questions around debt, and Sri Lanka is a great example in that. We have big questions about reorienting ethnic social relations in our societies. So I think what's happening after a very long time is that under neoliberalism, we were told only talk about the issue that bothers you. And if you come together only in a negative sense. We're against Hosni Mubarak, we're against Gaddafi. Never give a grand affirmative vision, because grand visions have done so much damage in the 20th century, and that was the whole Cold War stuff. But what's the alternative? That we are left to talk about the small things, the Gali Mohalla, the neighborhood things, and the grand vision is now left to NATO, to IMF, to World Bank, to multinational corporations. So these are the big thinkers of the world, and we are only talking about, water issues in our neighborhood, which are very key issues, but that they have to be linked to this grand vision. And I think the West, if the West can no longer give a grand vision, then it is time that people from the global South, we are not the laborers of their ideas. They think and we do. We have to become thinkers of this new world. We have to think creatively. We have to bring new ideas. New ideas of a new world have to be born in the global South. We have to fight this global division of labor, of them being the civilizational thinkers and we being the actors. 20th century is proof of the fact that even something like socialism, Marxism, which is a Western idea, it never actually wins in the West. It only actually does well in the global South. It's Cuba, it's Vietnam, it's China, it's so many other countries, Afghanistan, Central Asia. So I think we have to give that respect to our ancestors as well, for actually being big thinkers, but never getting the respect that someone like John Stuart Mill or other people did in the West. But these are people who were big thinkers, but they've not been given their due, and we have to start building on their ideas and start thinking about a very different world, because this world is now leading us nowhere but to genocide. Mohammed Tahsin Saab has a question. If you allow me, I can answer maybe about the Pashtun Tahfuz movement, but maybe Tahsin Saab on the second round, I'll come back to it. But my big takeaway from here is that we have to start thinking about grand visions. The future of the world is too important to be left just to the IMF and the NATO. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate how you all touch upon these kind of patterns of resonance across global social movements. I mean, everything happening in Palestine versus, the history of social movements in South Asia. It's one of the biggest reasons that I wanted to have this talk, and the reason that I called it the next wave. I think I want to open up the floor to the rest of the audience to be able to speak, and maybe Udita, you can call on people because I can't see anyone's hands. But I really appreciate all of the speakers talking about this kind of virality by empathy that I think movements have as an inherent quality, that you learn from one another, you are inspired by one another, and that at its core is how collective advocacy begins. So with that being said, anyone in the audience
I see
don't mind
Lalita's hand.
facilitating?
Lalita's hand is up.
Go ahead.
Hi. Yes, I'm here. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, first of all, as probably the oldest fossil on this group tonight, I just want to say I am absolutely energized beyond description than I have been in a long, long while, because I'm seeing so many young people, articulate, thinking, and with their own very clear visions, which I think are coming together tonight. As somebody who has been part of Swati, thank you for just calling me auntie. I thought it's better than being called granny. But I've been part of various movements. I still continue, even at this stage, no matter how low the energy seemed to be. I've been following everything that has happened in our neighborhood. And as I said, I have a personal and a political concern about building bridges and ties with Pakistan. I was just thinking as I was listening tonight, there's been a constant reiteration and an articulation of building that grand vision, that vision should not be something that is being created or dictated or hijacked by somebody else. I feel maybe one of the things, if we're going to seriously both conceptualize and concretize some of the things that we have been talking about tonight, is probably to put together a kind of for lack of a better word, I don't like the word a white paper, but it's something which can actually connect the many dots that we have been pinpointing today. What are the shared common ideas on which most of us have felt that they resonate? And if we are seriously, and I'm really talking also in the context of Sapan, because it's otherwise very easy to be, wandering all over the place. But I think that Sapan did provide us with a certain framework. And I think that we need to actually build, elaborate, maybe take some of those points and then see, all right, what is it that we have the capacity, which we see as being absolutely the priority issues on which we can actually come together. I mean, Sapan came together because we wanted to have a visa-free regime. But for heaven's sakes, we are not, as I said, my son-in-law is unable to get a visa to come to India, although he's an American citizen. And that has been the case now for over 10 years. So, there are many, I think we're tilting at several windmills. I think that we need to look at what are the concrete points on which we can get a resonance, say, from around the region. That's point number one. And I'm hoping that maybe that's something that we can take forward, because I worry that we have wonderful discussions, but then they kind of, don't seem to have a follow-up, which I think is essential. The second point, when we're all talking about the fact that, yes, we do not want to be dictated to by the imperial agendas and what's happening in the US and I mean, Germany, I just saw a note. I think it was who has just been there recently. And it's horrifying what kind of position the German government and the foreign minister and so on are actually taking. But I actually worry, and I would love to hear from some of you from Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, and so on. What are you hearing and seeing from also a number of the voices? Because I worry about the fact that we seem to have, we are rapidly losing our ability to feel even a basic compassion and a humanity, because what I'm hearing is that the Israeli, US, whatever propaganda has been so brilliantly articulated that people are mesmerized and seduced by the sheer kind of, the power of their as I said, propaganda. And I am just not seeing enough of the kind of compassion that I think that we actually need to be seeing. That's what I'm seeing in India. I don't know what it's like elsewhere. Of course, it's been great that millions of young people are out on the streets all over the world. But what is the kind of synergy eventually that we can pull out of that or create, which will put pressure on the United Nations to act, which will, in fact, get a woman presidential candidate to just say, look, when I come to power, I'm going to work for peace and we're going to end war. That's all that she has to say. But we are not hearing that. We are simply not seeing it or hearing it. And as I said, when I look at our own governmental position, it leaves me despairing. So, it's just a few thoughts, random, but I just thought I'd put it out onto the table. But having said all of that, I'm just very energized and very excited to see you all and to hear you all. Thanks.
Kushi, you need to unmute yourself.
The two questions, I think one, Amar said that Tahseen had asked, and one I see Khawar Rani had asked too. And there may be there are a lot of great discussions and points coming out in the chat box. And I'd just like to say that I think, I'm so glad, Swati, you're wearing your kafia. It's just amazing to see that the kafia is here. And I'm glad that we all have this solidarity and that we feel that solidarity. It gives us strength, but it also makes us feel that we are still a minority, because somehow a minority in the sense in not being able to counter the kind of, the absolute annihilation of peoples across because of certain interests. And we are all here trying our best, but it doesn't happen. But maybe how do we, we all have our own national battles, struggles, fights, inspirations, etc. But I think it's really important as SAPAN and for SAPAN to learn from each other and see what is happening. When Amar was talking about all the genocide that's taking place, to me, the thing that gives me the base for me to always to come back is 1971, where we had 3 million people killed by the Pakistani military junta. So there was that huge number, and everybody, my work in the villages give me the strength, even if it's a small areas scattered across the country, but it's grassroots based, etc. So it's not making a big impact. But these are the people who fought in the Liberation War and gave support to people in the Liberation War. So that gives me a kind of a basis for me to know that I can continue, because I'm still working with them. And I think we all need to learn from each other, and how can we get the picture together in a broader picture, and what do we want to then move on to from there on. So I don't know, maybe Rani and Tahseen wants to speak or something. or have the question read out and then somebody answers?
I think Tehseen has asked Ammar about PTM as a movement, which is one of our contemporaries. So maybe some comments on that?
And maybe explain to some of us what PTM is. Thank you.
Sure. It's the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement. It's a Pashtun defense movement. It's a national rights movement. And I'll give it first just talk about a little bit about how the scale of this movement. So this movement has basically rattled the Pakistani security establishment over the 6 years, because at a time when politics was dying in Pakistan, and I do believe there's been a death of politics and democracy in Pakistan over the past 6-7 years. Not that we were ever a shining example of democracy, but even the little bit of architecture, democratic architecture that was there was collapsing. Right at that moment, from the peripheries of Pakistan, this is the tribal area, Fatah, bordering Afghanistan. You had this young man in his late 20s who emerges. His name is Manzoor Pashtun, and he ignites the imagination of young Pashtuns. So this is very much a youth student-led movement initially in 2018 against the extrajudicial killings, the enforced disappearances, and the overall secrecy of the war on terror, and the way it was conducted by the US and the Pakistani military establishment since 2001. And not just 2001, there's a longer history of that you all are probably aware of, the Afghan Jihad in the 1980s, where this region became the base camp for America's war against the Soviet Union and against the socialist government in Afghanistan. So what's happened is that for the last 40, 50 years, this area has become a war zone, a death zone. No media is allowed, no journalists, no human rights organizations, no activists. So it became kind of a black hole within Pakistan. There are many others like that across the country. And the military establishment was, of course, profiting from these wars. These are now called Dalari Jange in Urdu, but dollar-fueled wars. And this guy, just like when he arrived on the scene, Manzoor Pashtun, he became a sensation because he started asking questions that everybody knew about, but that people were scared to ask, including accountability for the war on terror and its costs, and a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was one of the demands that he had in 2018. So across Pakistan, you had people stand with him. Pashtuns make up about 15%, 12 to 15% of the population, but they're very prominent, and people, democratic-minded people across the country supported them. Tehseen Saab was one of the people who hosted Manzoor Pashtun's event in Lahore in 2018 when he came to address Lahore, which is the political center of Pakistan. And I was also one of the people. I was actually, I hosted him at my university, and then I was fired from the university, and my academic career in Pakistan ended after I stood with Manzoor. So you can just imagine the kind of paranoia that the state had around this movement. But what's good is that this movement has continued to grow over the years. This is one of the biggest pro-peace, anti-war, and anti-militarization movement in Pakistan, and perhaps one of the biggest ones in South Asia. Recently, they just did a Jirga, which is a consultative meeting in Pashtun culture, where they were able to bring Pashtuns from across the political divide, thousands of people. And one of the things that one of the decisions that this Jirga made was that they gave 60 days to both the Pakistani military and the Taliban to leave Pashtun lands. Which, I mean, it's a symbolic thing. It's not that the military is going to leave out the Taliban, but the fact that you could bring so many people from across the country and make such a daring and bold proclamation shows that people are no longer scared of the consequences. And it has ignited a similar movement in Balochistan, which is another black hole in Pakistan's political imagination. And that is an even more interesting movement because it's led by a young woman. in her mid to late 20s, Mahrang Baloch, whose father was a victim of enforced disappearance and was murdered. And she's become the face of the suffering and the resilience of the Baloch people. And she toured across Pakistan. And the big thing is that people from across Pakistan are supporting these movements. And this, of course, goes back to the neo-colonial nature of the Pakistani state. And Ma'am Khushi mentioned Bengal, so the crimes that were committed in 70-71 are part of this larger legacy of this neo-colonial state structure that is willing to sacrifice its own people for the sake of the reproduction of powers of generals. And now you have Pashtuns, Baloch, but even many Punjabis and Sindhis and Gilgitis and Kashmiris who are sick and tired of this security establishment and its games. And I would just end by saying that with this new Cold War that's emerging in the region, the US, which has very tight relations with our security establishment, the Pashtun leadership believes that they are trying to use the Pashtun lands and the Baloch lands and the rest of Pakistan, to be honest, for another Cold War, and this time against China. So Pakistan has a very contradictory kind of a situation where we're close to China because America is not giving us any aid at the moment. But at the same time, our leadership is willing to, military leadership is willing to sell out once again and push this entire region into another vortex of war and chaos, much like the 80s. So we have to have a very strong kind of national movement against militarization, but also a regional vision that the mistakes that were made in the 1980s, the Afghan Jihad, it not only destroyed Afghanistan, it destroyed Pakistan, it created problems for China, for Central Asia, for India, for Iran, the whole region. Pakistan should not play that role again. And that same goes for progressive movements across the region in South Asia, in India, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka. We have to have a vision for regional integration with all our differences, all our problems. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, China, Sri Lanka, Nepal, India, all of us will have to, Bangladesh, all of us have to live in the same region. We can work out our differences, but we will not become agents in foreign wars, which will only cause death and destruction for our people and our region.
Thank you so much, Amar. Really appreciate your insights and fascinating discussion. I mean, we've had so many intersections. I mean, we've basically talked and touched on so many issues. I mean, not just human rights, not just activism, not just social movements, but also this whole intersection of geopolitics, foreign policy, and so on and so forth. I mean, these obviously do have impacts on the wider topics that we're discussing today as well. So thanks a lot for a really interesting discussion. I think we went through so many motions today in terms of covering so much ground across South Asia. And I mean, I'm too overwhelmed to even think about trying to summarize what we actually went through over the last hour and a half. But yeah, so now we are drawing to a close, more or less, of our session. And before I conclude, before I move on to the word of thanks, so to speak, I'd like all of us to switch on their video so that we can have a photo with all the speakers and the volunteers. Do you think you'll be able to do that? So I think I will.
I think some people are on YouTube and therefore not visible here.
Okay, so fine. So yeah, I think I'll take a snapshot now. And okay, and right. I think I've taken a decent snapshot of all of us. Thank you so much again for joining us and for being a part of this program. Thank you, Faisal, for moderating the program as well, despite the many difficulties that you had to face with the power cut and the blackout. Just a quick note, As you know, SAPAN is a voluntary organization. If you like the work we do, and if you would like to contribute to help keep us going, please donate. All contributions to SAPAN are basically tax deductible in the US. We cannot emphasize enough the importance of your feedback as well regarding this event. To further our cause, please find the link. I will paste the link to the feedback form as well in the chat box. So if you all have any sort of feedback that you want to share with us, please do. Huge thanks to everyone who made this event possible, and to all of you all watching as well on other streams and channels. A huge thanks again to all our speakers and to our moderator, Faisal, who again had to moderate despite so many difficulties on his end. A big thank you to all our event team behind the scenes, as well as to everyone who you saw on screen as well, our speakers. Faisal Lalani conceptualized and put the event together with help from Sarita Batalla, along with Khushi Kabir, Beena Sarwa, Karwa Mumtaz. We would also like to acknowledge Lalita Ramdas and Kavita Srivastava. Special thanks again to Vidya Kakra, Pragyan Srivastava, and Sarah Arshad for their hard work in handling pre-production, during, and post-event, all those tasks that actually made this event possible and helped us go through from A to Z fairly smoothly. We would like to formally conclude the event now, and we will stop the recording and the live stream just after I end these remarks. However, if anyone wishes to stay on and continue engaging in discussions or networking, you're most welcome to do so. Thank you all. Good night and goodbye. Good night from Sri Lanka, but good morning, basically, or good afternoon from various other parts of the world. For now, we hope to see you next month in our next episode of SAPAN's ongoing program on social movements and various other issues. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.